the paradox of morality, why being good can feel wrong. Immanuel Kant's philosophy, all right, let's jump right into it. Imagine this: you're faced with a decision. It's not a simple choice between good and bad, but rather one between doing what feels morally right and doing what feels human. You know what you should do, but part of you resists, questioning whether it's even fair to make that choice. Why is it that sometimes following the moral path feels almost wrong, or at the very least, uncomfortable? This is where Kant comes in, the 18th century philosopher Immanuel Kant. He had a radical idea that morality isn't about what feels good or bad, but about what is rationally right or wrong. According to Kant, morality is grounded in reason, an unshakable universal principle. But here's the twist: the very thing Kant sees as necessary for morality often conflicts with our emotions, our desires, and our gut instincts. This creates a paradox, and that's what we're exploring today. Let me give you a situation. Imagine you have a friend who's been unfairly accused of something terrible. You know they're innocent, but telling the truth will lead to serious consequences for them, maybe even their life being ruined. What do you do? Do you lie to protect them, or do you tell the truth? Because, as Kant argues, lying is always wrong. This is where the tension arises in Kant's philosophy. He believed in something called the categorical imperative, which means that moral rules are absolute. They don't bend to circumstances, emotions, or personal stakes. Lying is wrong, not because of the outcome it produces, but because it violates a fundamental rule. It disrespects humanity's capacity for rational thought and autonomy. In Kant's view, if you lie, even for a good reason, you are treating another person as a means to an end, not as an end in themselves. But here's where it gets tricky. In real-world situations, doing the right thing according to Kant's universal moral law can feel deeply wrong. Why is that? Why does following a strict principle leave us questioning whether we've really acted in the best way? This is where the paradox of morality kicks in. The tension between our rational sense of duty and our emotional instincts makes us feel like sometimes being good can feel bad. Now, let's break this down. Kant's philosophy is grounded in the idea that morality is deontological, meaning it's based on duty, not consequences. If you act out of pure duty, you are acting morally, regardless of what happens as a result. But here's the thing: we're humans. We care about outcomes. We feel empathy for people. We don't just want to be right, we want to help. And that's where the emotional resistance comes in. Our feelings, which are often tied to the consequences of our actions, can make us feel like the morally right choice is the wrong one for the people involved.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound spiritual lesson.
So, what do we do with this? Should we ignore our emotions entirely and stick to cold, hard principles? Do we risk being morally right at the expense of being compassionate? Kant would argue that compassion, while important, shouldn't compromise our moral duties. But that leaves us with a dilemma. How do we reconcile our desire to act morally with our human need to feel connected, empathetic, and even protective of those we care about? This brings up a deeper question: is morality really about feeling good, or is it about doing good, regardless of how it feels? Kant would say it's the latter. He believed that acting morally is about aligning our will with what reason tells us is right. And reason, according to Kant, is universal. It applies to everyone, in every situation. That's why lying is wrong, no matter the reason. Once we start justifying exceptions, we undermine the very foundation of morality itself. But again, that doesn't sit well with most of us. We live in a world where context matters, where relationships and emotions play a huge role in our decision-making. And this is where the paradox deepens the more we try to act in accordance with Kant's strict moral laws. the more we might feel like we're betraying our humanity. So, let me ask you, is it possible to be too moral? Can adhering too rigidly to principles make us lose sight of the messy, complex realities of life? Kant would say no. He'd argue that staying true to moral laws is what makes us human, what elevates us above mere instinct. But for many of us, that doesn't erase the discomfort we feel when doing the right thing seems to hurt the very people we care about. This tension between reason and feeling is at the heart of Kant's moral philosophy. It forces us to confront one of the hardest truths about morality sometimes. Doing what's right doesn't feel good. It doesn't align with our desires, our instincts, or even what we think the kind thing to do is. But Kant challenges us to rise above those feelings, to act out of duty, not emotion. But here's the real kicker: what if we're wrong? What if, by following these rigid moral principles, we end up causing more harm than good? What if in trying to be moral we lose touch with what it means to be compassionate, empathetic, or even just human? Duty vs. compassion. Can morality and humanity coexist? Alright, so now we're deep into this paradox. Kant's philosophy, which places duty above all else, tells us that morality is about following universal principles, not about how we feel. But this raises a crucial question: can morality and our humanity coexist? Can we balance our rational duty with our emotional need to care for others? Or are these two forces destined to be in conflict? Let's think about this. On one hand, Kant says that when we act morally, we must do so from a sense of duty, not because it makes us feel good or because it benefits someone we care about. That means if you're helping someone because it gives you a sense of satisfaction or because they're a friend, you're not truly acting morally, you're acting out of self-interest. According to Kant, moral actions must be motivated by pure respect for the moral law, not by any personal gains or emotional ties. But here's where the tension comes in. As humans, we feel. We're emotional beings. We care about the people around us and we want to protect them from harm. When we see someone we love suffering, our instinct is to help, not because it's our duty, but because we feel compelled by our emotions. And that's where Kant's philosophy can feel cold or disconnected from our lived experience. How can we ignore our emotional instincts and still feel like we're doing the right thing? Let's go back to our earlier example. Your friend is unfairly accused of something terrible. If you tell the truth, you'll betray them, but if you lie, you'll break Kant's categorical imperative. Kant would argue that you must tell the truth, no matter how much it hurts, because lying violates a universal moral law. But emotionally, that feels wrong. You care about your friend. You don't want to see them suffer. So where does that leave you? Stuck between duty and compassion, between being morally right and emotionally torn. Here's the deeper question: is it even possible to act purely from duty, without any emotional influence? We are, after all, emotional creatures. Can we really separate ourselves from our feelings and act purely out of rational duty, as Kant suggests? Or are our emotions an essential part of what it means to be moral? Think about this: if you help someone out of compassion, does that make your action any less moral? Kant would say yes, because you're not acting purely out of duty, but many of us would argue that compassion is what makes us human. Compassion connects us to others, allowing us to feel their pain and act in their best interest. So, does morality require us to strip away that compassion, or can morality and humanity work together? This brings us to a powerful conclusion. Maybe the tension between duty and compassion isn't something we have to solve. Maybe it's something we have to live with. Kant challenges us to think about morality in a way that goes beyond our feelings, but that doesn't mean we should ignore our humanity. Perhaps true morality is about finding a balance, acting out of duty when necessary, but also allowing ourselves to be guided by compassion when it's appropriate. But this leaves us with another question: what happens when duty and compassion point us in opposite directions? Should we prioritize one over the other, or is there a middle ground where both can coexist? This inner conflict between duty and compassion is not something with an easy resolution. It's a fundamental part of the human condition. It's what makes morality challenging, but also what makes it deeply meaningful. We live in the space between these two forces, constantly negotiating, constantly balancing. And maybe that's the point. Morality isn't about finding the perfect solution, it's about wrestling with the tension between duty and compassion and making the best choice we can in each moment. Consider another example. Imagine you work at a company and you discover that a colleague has made a mistake that could cost them their job. You know that reporting the issue is the right thing to do according to the company's policies. Your duty is to truth and transparency. But on the other hand, you know this colleague is going through a tough time. Maybe they're struggling with personal issues, or maybe they've always been a good person and this was just an honest mistake. The compassionate part of you wants to give them a break, to cover for them or help them fix the mistake quietly. But your duty, your adherence to the rules, demands that you report it. Kant would argue that there's no question here, you must report the mistake. Why? Because the moral law is universal, and any exception would undermine that universality. If you lie or cover up the truth, even for a seemingly good reason, you've violated the categorical imperative. You've treated your colleague not as an end in themselves, but as a means to an end, in this case, sparing them from consequences. For Kant, morality doesn't bend to individual circumstances, no matter how empathetic or compassionate you feel. However, our emotional reality complicates this. As humans, we live in relationships, in communities. We don't just think in terms of abstract duties, we think in terms of people. Compassion is a deeply rooted part of our moral psyche, and sometimes it feels like the most moral thing to do is to show leniency, to act with kindness, even if that means bending the rules or defying a strict sense of duty. So here's the real question: when duty and compassion collide, how do we decide which one to follow? Do we follow Kant's cold, rational path and stick to our duties, or do we allow compassion to guide us, even if it means breaking the rules? Let's complicate this even further. What if compassion is a duty? What if our obligation to care for others, to show empathy, is itself a moral law? Could it be that sometimes the best way to honor someone's dignity is not to follow the rules, but to act with kindness and understanding? After all, Kant's philosophy emphasizes treating others as ends in themselves, respecting their autonomy and humanity. Couldn't that mean being compassionate when the situation calls for it? But here's the paradox: if we start bending moral rules for the sake of compassion, what happens to morality as a whole? If we justify lying today to protect someone's feelings, could we justify it tomorrow for something less noble? If we let our compassion override our duty once, where do we draw the line? This is the slippery slope that Kant warns us about. He believed that once we allow exceptions to moral rules, we lose the very foundation of ethics itself. Without universal principles, morality becomes a matter of personal preference, and that risks chaos. Yet, life constantly tests us in ways that pull us between these two forces. And this is where we as individuals must grapple with a question that only we can answer: what kind of person do I want to be? Do I want to be someone who follows the rules, no matter the cost? Or do I want to be someone who prioritizes compassion, even if it means bending those rules? Here's an even deeper thought to consider: can we ever act purely out of duty, without any influence from compassion or personal desire? Kant would argue that true morality requires us to act from duty alone without being swayed by emotions or personal stakes. But is that even possible? As humans, our emotions are part of everything we do. But even when we try to act purely out of duty, aren't we still influenced, at least in some small way, by our feelings? Isn't the very reason we care about morality in the first place because we feel the weight of moral responsibility? The inner conflict when duty and compassion collide now, we've reached the heart of the matter, the collision between duty and compassion. This is where things get messy, where the clean lines of Kant's moral philosophy smash into the complex, emotional reality of human life. You see, Kant presents morality as something neat, something governed by unwavering rules. But life is anything but neat, isn't it? It's full of grey areas, personal connections, and moments where our emotions scream louder than our sense of duty. Let's face it, this conflict is something we all deal with at some point. You feel a duty to tell the truth, but you also feel compassion for someone who might be hurt by that truth. You feel a duty to be fair, but you also feel empathy for someone who, in their particular situation, seems to deserve a little extra consideration. It's in these moments that Kant's philosophy can feel almost inhuman, asking us to ignore what makes us human: the ability to feel deeply, to empathize, to care about those around us. Living with the paradox, finding balance in an imperfect world. So, here we are standing at the crossroads of duty and compassion. We've explored the depths of Kant's philosophy and the tension it creates within us. We feel the weight of duty, the pull of compassion, and the discomfort of knowing that sometimes, no matter what we choose, it won't feel entirely right. This is the paradox of morality, why being good can sometimes feel wrong. But the truth is, life isn't about finding simple answers. Kant gives us a framework, a moral compass that helps guide our actions, but it doesn't always provide the comfort of certainty, and that's okay. In fact, living with the paradox is part of being human. It's part of what makes morality such a profound and personal journey. Here's the thing: Kant's categorical imperative offers clarity in a world that's often messy and confusing. It tells us that there are certain principles we should never violate, no matter how tempting it is to make exceptions. It forces us to think beyond our immediate desires, beyond the specific emotions of the moment, and consider what it means to act in a way that respects the dignity of all humans. This is the strength of Kant's philosophy. It pushes us to aspire to a higher moral standard, one that isn't swayed by the changing tides of personal feelings or circumstances. But does that mean we should ignore our emotions entirely? Of course not. Emotions are a vital part of the human experience, and compassion is essential to how we relate to others. The real challenge, then, is finding balance. How do we act in accordance with reason and moral duty while still honoring our emotional connection to the people around us? And maybe that's the key, realizing that morality isn't a rigid system of rules to follow blindly. It's a dynamic process, one where we constantly negotiate the tension between principles and empathy. Sometimes, the right thing to do is to follow the rule, even when it hurts. Other times, compassion might call us to make an exception, but we must do so mindfully, understanding the potential consequences of bending those moral laws. This balance requires us to be both rational and reflective. We need to be aware of the moral framework guiding our decisions, but also sensitive to the context and the people involved. It's like walking a tightrope, where we're constantly adjusting, constantly checking ourselves. And in that tension, in that discomfort, we find the true depth of what it means to be moral. So, let's come full circle. Why does being good sometimes feel wrong? Because morality at its core isn't about feeling good, it's about making hard choices that reflect our highest principles, even when they conflict with our desires or emotions. It's about holding ourselves accountable to something greater than immediate outcomes or personal comfort. And yet, it's also about being human, about caring for others, and finding ways to act with kindness in a world that doesn't always make it easy. I'll leave you with this. Is it possible to live a moral life without ever feeling conflicted? Probably not. But maybe that's the point. Maybe the fact that we struggle with these questions means we're on the right path, because it shows we care, it shows we're engaged, it shows we're willing to wrestle with the complexity of what it means to be good. And maybe, just maybe, that's what makes morality so powerful. It's not about finding the perfect answer, but about the journey we take in trying to live as fully and as ethically as we can. Thank you for watching, and I hope this has given you something to think about as you navigate your own moral choices, balancing duty, compassion, and the paradox of what it means to be truly good.